Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Regulator Roundtable. I'm Jeremiah DeGennaro, Site Manager at Alamance Battleground. In this video series, I'm speaking with authors who have written about the regulator movement during their careers to find out more from them about how the regulators figure into their own personal story and let them reflect on the legacies of the movement as we commemorate the 250th anniversary of the Battle of Alamance. Of the recent scholarship of the regulator movement, one book in particular stands out for shifting the way we think about the movement by taking a complicated series of events and breaking down the many unique but interconnected factors that drove the regulators. In her book, Breaking Loose Together, Dr. Marjoleine Kars examined the political and economic world of the North Carolina backcountry, and her examination of Great Awakening religious principles among North Carolinians reinvigorated the debate over the motives of the regulators. Dr. Kars is Associate Professor of History at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. She is also the author of a new book titled Blood on the River, a chronicle of mutiny and freedom on the Wild Coast. Dr. Kars, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's really a pleasure to talk with you because even almost 20 years after it was published, Breaking Loose Together represents this very reinvigorating work that in some ways many of our local historians are still responding to. Now, after 20 years, is it still a work that you think about from time to time?
It's still a work I'm proud of. I mean, when I look at it, I think the research was solid. I think it makes a very useful contribution to the history of North Carolina and the history of the revolution and the history of religion in America, really. There obviously after 20 years, there are some ways in which I might do it slightly differently now, but I think the book has actually stood the test of time so far, and I'm really glad about that. And I still get nice emails from folks who had, for instance, ancestors who were involved in the regulation, and people read it and say, now I understand better what my ancestor was up against and what they stood for. And so that feels good to still get emails from people after such a long time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's thank you for giving our descendants group a shout out because they have really become one of the key stakeholder groups for Alamance Battleground. So let's go back to the creation of the Breaking Loose Together as a research project. Do you remember the first time you heard about the regulators?
Well, I first heard about the regulators when I visited the Regulator bookstore in Durham, North Carolina, which was my favorite bookstore in town. I had grown up in the Netherlands, so when I came to Durham to start university, I had, of course, no idea what the regulators were. And when the folks in the bookstore explained it to me, I remember thinking that this must have been a very powerful movement to still speak to people so much later. But then I kind of forgot about it until I went to graduate school, also at Duke, and took a class with Professor Peter Wood. And I think he had us read some of the petitions that the regulators had written. And then as I began to study the American Revolution, obviously, I learned more about them. But I did not set out to specifically write about the regulation. When I started my dissertation, I thought I was going to write about sexuality in the backcountry. And I was reading petitions and records about bastardy cases, as they were called. And it just didn't speak to me very much. And then I went to the Quaker archives in Greensboro, and I went to the archives of the Separate Baptists. And when I read those records, the Piedmont really came alive to me, and I realized that these religious folks had been deeply involved in politics. And so then I came back to the regulation, and I decided that I really wanted to look at the interplay of politics and religion in the North Carolina Piedmont on the eve of the American Revolution, because there was a real debate among historians to what extent religion had played a role in the coming of the revolution. And looking at these records in the Piedmont, it seemed to me that it had.
A lot of people who read Breaking Loose Together, they talk about the religious aspect of your research, and that really is the most memorable part of the book. And it's that part of your book really colors our interpretation at Alamance Battleground. But it was interesting to me that you also were talking about politics, economics. Did you begin trying to compartmentalize that, or did you see everything completely having influence over different elements?
Well, that was partly a decision about how to organize the book. And I think if I were to write a book today, I might just make it more of a story and weave those elements in. But at the time, I really wanted to show that the regulators had had real grievances, because there was a strain in the historiography that talked about them sort of being hysterical farmers who didn't really understood how the world worked. And the more I did research about what was going on economically in the Piedmont, the more I realized these folks were spot on. And so I wanted to make, for instance, the section on economics and on land as powerful as possible. So I had a whole chapter on land. I had a whole chapter on debt and credit, both of which are issues that have remained crucial to American farmers to this day. And I wanted the readers to know that these people faced real economic grievances and that their solutions were creative and worth knowing about. So that's why I had religion and land and credit and politics all in separate chapters to give them their due, really. And then the last 4 or 5 chapters of the book are really about the story of the regulation itself. One of the things that I think is really striking is that it was not, on the whole, a violent movement.
Agreed.
That there was lots for people to have been very angry about, but the Battle of Alamance itself was really instigated by Governor Tryon and the many leading men he brought with him. There was some violence in Hillsborough in 68 and in 70. But on the whole, I find that it's actually remarkable how restrained the regulators were, given how they were thwarted time after time after time after time.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, there is violence, and it certainly ends in a very violent moment. And you more than anybody, of course, knows that since that's what your job is all about at Alamance. But it was really, in many ways, I think, a remarkably peaceful protest movement.
Mm-hmm.
And when violence happened, it was very targeted.
It's worth noting that the movement begins in a very American way as it is a organized grassroots movement. It's a petition movement. It's a letter writing campaign. And
yes.
So there is this question that we have to answer at Alamance Battleground, which is, how does this peaceful protest movement become a battle in which scores of people are killed and wounded? And it makes it a very unique story, but then it's also a story that seems to echo throughout history, especially.
Well, I think you're quite right to call it an American movement. I mean, it starts with this American optimism that if we just point out to government what is wrong, then surely people will do the right thing.
Exactly.
And they maintain that through first talking to local officials, then talking to officials on the provincial level, and then entering elections and sending representatives like Herman Husband. And it's really only when they're thwarted over and over that people engage in limited extra legal violence or extra legal action. But even then, when they say, for instance, we're not going to pay our taxes anymore to the government, they say, we'll collect the taxes ourselves, we'll hold them, and when government has been properly regulated, we will pay our money. So there are lots of ways in which they're doing the right thing, even if they're doing it in a way that the provincial authorities do not agree with, that this is the proper way to go about it. But it is really a very American movement in its optimism, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. It's. You refer to it as a rebellion. I think it's rightly referred to as a rebellion, but it is an incredibly orderly rebellion when you look
Yes.
at the
Yes.
So
yes.
while we're talking about the regulation, comparatively potentially with other movements, I wanted to read something back to you from your introduction that caught my eye when I was preparing for this interview. And you wrote, "The regulation represents a moment of protest against the slow separation of morality from economics that characterized and enabled the development of the emerging capitalist order." Which is a very interesting way of merging the economic concerns with the religious realities of the time. So did you see that as something that is unique to the regulation, or is that more illustrative of agrarian revolts and uprisings during a broader time period?
I think it is both. I mean, I think it is a lust. I mean, I think the regulators are more explicit about it than most other folks. But this protest against this notion that capitalism is a system in which morality doesn't have much of a place is something that people from below have protested beginning in early modern Europe, going through the English Revolution. They have protested that in the Americas, of course. Not only farmers, although farmers have certainly been very clear in that, not only the regulation, but Shays Rebellion, rebellions on the main frontier in the early modern republic, the Whiskey Rebels, of course, but also enslaved people who fought against slavery, abolitionists, just large numbers of ordinary people who have often found inspiration in their own religious beliefs to say, this is not how we think that God intended the world to look. And our religious beliefs compel us to do something about it, even though we do it with trepidation, because normally we're peace-loving people who support their government.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we see it very explicitly in the regulation, but I think that both this protest of ordinary people saying, this is not how the world ought to be, and the strong activism of American farmers are part of a much longer story. And we certainly see it in the Age of Revolution, of which the regulators are at the very dawn, really.
Let's talk a little bit about some of your other work, because you do have a new book out, Blood on the River, which is about a slave uprising in Berbice. Can you talk just a little bit about how that project came to be?
Yeah, so it's a book about a massive slave uprising in a Dutch colony in what is now the Republic of Guyana, which is wedged between Suriname and Venezuela on the Caribbean coast of South America. And after I finished my book on the regulators, I wanted to do something that would get me back to my Dutch roots a little bit. I wanted to look at the wider Atlantic, not merely North America, but the Americas. And so I went to the Dutch archive, started poking around, and came across all these records about a colony I had never heard of, Berbice, and this massive slave uprising that had happened there in 1763 and 1764. And because it was such a big rebellion that lasted more than a year, I was really curious, after having studied the regulation and the American Revolution, to see how this rebellion might connect to that age of revolution, and whether the rebellions of enslaved people were as complicated politically as any other rebellion at this time period. And I found that certainly in this case it was, that it was not just a fight between enslaved people and enslavers, but it was also a struggle among the enslaved for who would be in charge, whose vision of liberty and freedom would be the reigning one, just as that was the case in the American Revolution. And at the same time, the slaveholders were also very divided amongst themselves, not unlike what we see happening in the American Revolution, where there are different opinions among the elite, but also some are support Britain and some support the freedom fighters. So, so there were interesting parallels, even as it is, of course, a story that is also interesting in its own right.
Yeah, it's interesting to note those types of similarities when you're talking about different parts of the Americas, and I guess it is a similar time period, certainly in that early age of revolution. But,
same decade.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Similar issues. Throughout history, I think it has often been a struggle for how ordinary people want to live their lives, and how those who are in charge and who often benefit from the labor of ordinary people would like to organize society. And so you see related struggles from below in places where you might not think they were related, but they are. Not only geographically, but enslaved people have as many dreams about what a just world should look like as embattled farmers in North Carolina.
In an interview, you referred to the uprising in Berbice as a nearly successful rebellion. Would you use the same terminology for the regulation, or do you think it was not quite as close to success?
No, I would. I mean, the fact that the regulators were just before the Battle of Alamance reaching out all the way to the coast in North Carolina, and that people there were interested in what they had to say and were beginning to join them, and that the authorities were worried about this. It's one of the reasons Governor Tryon was so eager to march west, is because he felt this was going to get out of hand potentially. I think shows that they had a remarkable amount of success. And of course, the fact that you lose doesn't make your movement ineffective. The fact that we're still talking about the regulation 250 years later is in itself remarkable. And so somebody has said to me, you seem to be attracted to rebellions that are almost successful. But the truth of the matter is, of course, that most rebellions in history did not succeed. And yet people had the gumption and the drive and the optimism and the strength to keep trying and trying and trying. As Frederick Douglass said, power never gives up anything without a demand. And people have done a lot of demanding in history, and they have often not been successful, at least not at that moment. But whatever they did provided a spark for somebody 10, 20, 40, sometimes 60 years later. And I'm enough of an optimist myself to think that those past struggles have helped us create a better, albeit by no means perfect, society today.
I really appreciate that you say we're still talking about this 250 years after. I'm reminded of Governor Josiah Martin's quote after he comes back, and he wanted the whole thing to, the word that he used was oblivion. He wanted to just completely forget about the thing. And obviously that did not happen. And this continues to be a very interesting story. Now, one question I wanted to ask you specifically, because in the regulator, all the treatments of the regulator movement, we see it is a very male-centered, male-dominated movement. And in some of your public presentations that I was able to see, you tried to address that lack of a women's perspective in the regulator movement. Now, looking back on your research, Did you consider that to be that lack of women's perspective? Did you consider it to be a silence in the historical record, or is that a feature of the leadership of the regulators that they make it that way rather than just not writing about the involvement of women?
Well, again, I would say it's both, in the sense that in the pre-revolutionary period, and in fact throughout the revolution and the early republic, um, women's formal political involvement is slight.
Mhm.
And the first time that we see massive numbers of American women petitioning, for instance, signing petitions, is when they protest the Indian Removal Act of 1830. That's the first time that huge numbers of American women feel compelled to sign petitions. And when you read their petitions, they're saying, we know we shouldn't be doing this. We're not trying to tell men what to do. Men are in charge of the political realm. We just really can't help ourselves, but we know you're going to do the right thing. They're very careful. And so even signing petitions, which now to us seems like a very benign, low-key way to start a movement, is in the late revolutionary period something that would have discredited the regulators if women had signed those petitions. And so I think that leaders like Herman Husband clearly were, patriarchal men who believed that politics was the realm of women. I have no doubt about that. So I think that the regulators, like all other men at that time in the colonies, thought that women's political role was extremely limited. Do I think that women did not have a lot to say about this movement at home? Absolutely. Did those kind of conversations make it into the record? No. But it is inevitable, I think, that women would have talked with husbands and sons about should they join, should they not, what were the pros, what were the cons, what would happen if they went to jail or they were killed, or that women urged their men on or tried to restrain them, particularly because if I was correct, and I think that I was, that much of the impetus lay in radical religious churches. In those churches, women had a greater say than they did in the Church of England, for instance. So I think on a private level, women would have been quite vocal, but in the petitions themselves, in the activism, we don't see them at all. And I think that's a sign of the times.
The purpose of this interview series has been to look back 250 years, since the Battle of Alamance in 1771. Of course, it's a very long movement, so we've passed all sorts of 250th anniversaries
Yes.
for the regulator movement, and we're afforded a chance to look back. And now, looking back 250 years on, what lessons do you think the regulator movement has for us today in 2021?
Oh, I think it's a movement that has lots of lessons for us today, and I wish it was much better known, and I think it ought to be. I think it has lessons in that it shows us, first of all, this idea of how morality ought to be a part of our economic system. I think that, and that economic life should be organized for the greatest benefit of the greatest number of people, as opposed to only for a small number. I think that as we battle environmental degradation and we battle climate change and we battle white supremacy and racism, those messages are more important than ever, because an economic system that is built on unlimited growth just simply cannot be sustained. And so this idea that we need to look more at what is good for a larger community, and I mean a larger community, because battles like fighting Corona at the moment shows us that we are globally all in the same boat. And that if we don't fight these issues globally, it's not going to work out. So I think the message of the regulators is still an important one. I think their message that religion can play an important role in people thinking about politics is an important role, particularly at a time when so much religious evangelicalism in the South has been more on a conservative side of the political spectrum, and the regulators were an important strain of American thought, this radical religious belief in one's own truth. And so I would not want that to be forgotten. I think anytime we have a mass movement where people have the guts and the gumption to stand up for what they believe in is a moment of inspiration that none of us ought to forget, and that should give all of us courage in whatever it is we want to fight for or agitate for, or whatever change we want to make today. So I think it has a number of lessons, and I do think it's a movement that it was really much more important than it has often been recognized, in part because we have a historiography that has so often favored the Northeast and has looked at the South, not always with the respect the South deserves. Obviously, there has been much to criticize with slavery, and rightly so. But there have also been important movements in the South, I think of populism, for instance, or abolitionism that have been important. And so I think the regulators deserve a bigger role, a bigger place in American history, not just North Carolina history.
Well said, and I couldn't agree more. Dr. Kars, thank you so much for joining me today. It was a pleasure to
You're
speak
very
with
welcome.
you. Her book, Breaking Loose Together, is available wherever books are sold, but it is also available at the Alamance Battleground gift shop if you would like to support us there. And her new book, Blood on the River, A Chronicle of Mutiny and Freedom on the Wild Coast, is available now as well. Again, Dr. Kars, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.